He had nothing, no home, no money, no respect. People spat at him, called him a failure, treated him like human trash. But when death came for an innocent child on the coldest night of winter, this broken man revealed who he'd been before the war broke him. Thomas Mitchell had been living on the streets of downtown Portland for 3 years. 2 months and 16 days, not that anyone bothered to count except Thomas himself, who marked each day in a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket, one of the few possessions he'd managed to hold on to from his previous life. To the thousands of people who passed him daily on 5th Street, Thomas was just another piece of urban decay. He sat with his back against the brick wall of Morrison's Electronics, a cardboard sign propped beside him with the words, "Homeless veteran, anything helps," scrawled in fading marker. His clothes were layered and dirty, his beard unkempt, his eyes often unfocused from whatever cheap alcohol he'd managed to buy with the day's donations. The morning rush hour crowd had developed a practiced choreography around his presence. Business people in expensive suits would veer wide around his spot, careful not to make eye contact. Mothers with strollers would cross to the other side of the street entirely. Teenagers would sometimes laugh and point, recording videos for social media with captions like "Portland's finest" and "Your tax dollars at work." Detective Maria Santos of the Portland Police Bureau knew Thomas by name, though not by choice. She'd been called to move him along dozens of times over the past 3 years. Complaints from business owners about him, scaring away customers, reports of public intoxication, the occasional disturbance. When someone decided to harass the homeless man for sport, "Come on, Tom," Detective Santos would say, not unkindly but firmly. "You know you can't stay here overnight. Let's move along." Thomas would comply without argument, gathering his few belongings into a worn military surplus duffel bag and shuffling to the next doorway, the next alley, the next place where he might find a few hours of peace before being moved along again. He never complained, never argued, never explained. He just moved. What Detective Santos and the rest of Portland didn't know was that Thomas hadn't always been homeless. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days ago, he'd been Colonel Thomas Mitchell, United States Army, with 27 years of distinguished service, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, and a Silver Star earned in the mountains of Afghanistan. He'd commanded a battalion, led men through impossible situations, and been responsible for saving more lives than he'd ever bothered to count. But war changes people, and some changes are invisible until they're not. The nightmares had started during his 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. The panic attacks came during his 4th. By his 5th and final deployment, Thomas was holding himself together with caffeine, determination, and an increasingly fragile sense of duty to the soldiers under his command. He'd made it through that last tour. All of his men had come home alive. But somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains, between firefights and IED explosions and watching 19-year-old kids try to hold their buddies' blood inside their bodies, Thomas had lost something essential. Not his courage, that remained intact. Not his honor, that was carved into his soul. But his ability to function in a world that wasn't actively trying to kill him had simply vanished. The transition back to civilian life had been brutal. The Army had tried to help, therapy, medication, support groups. His wife Sarah had tried to understand. His 2 children had tried to be patient. His friends had tried to include him. But Thomas felt like he was watching his old life through glass, unable to touch it or be touched by it. The drinking had started as a way to sleep. Then it became a way to get through the day. When Sarah finally filed for divorce, Thomas had understood. When she'd moved across the country with their children, he'd signed the papers without a fight. When he'd lost his civilian job due to repeated absences and erratic behavior, he'd cleaned out his desk without complaint. The final straw had been the night he'd woken up screaming in his apartment, convinced that insurgents were coming through his bedroom window. When the police arrived, called by concerned neighbors, they'd found Thomas barricaded behind an overturned dresser, armed with a kitchen knife and completely convinced he was under attack. The incident had resulted in an involuntary psychiatric hold and, eventually, eviction from his apartment. That's how Colonel Thomas Mitchell, decorated war hero and leader of men, had become Tom the homeless drunk on 5th Street. The transition had been surprisingly easy. When you have no address, no job, and no family, the distance between housed and homeless is smaller than most people imagine. But on December 15th, the coldest night Portland had seen in a decade, Thomas would discover that some things about a person never really go away, no matter how much alcohol and despair you use to try to bury them. The temperature had been dropping all day, and by evening, the forecast was calling for a low of 8 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerous cold for anyone, potentially lethal for those without shelter. The city had opened emergency warming centers, and outreach workers had been trying to convince the homeless population to come inside. Thomas had declined their offers, as he always did. The warming centers were crowded, noisy, and full of people. 3 things that triggered his anxiety worse than the cold ever could. He'd found what he thought was a relatively sheltered spot in the doorway of a closed office building, wrapped himself in his sleeping bag, and the layers of clothing that served as his only protection against the elements. Around 11 p.m., he was wakened by the sound of voices. A man and woman arguing in the parking lot across the street. "I told you we should have left an hour ago," the woman was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "The roads are getting icy." "Relax, Jennifer," the man replied. "It's a BMW, not a skateboard. We'll be fine." Thomas watched as they approached a luxury sedan. The man was clearly intoxicated, swaying slightly as he walked, while the woman, presumably his wife, was struggling to keep up in high heels on the increasingly slick pavement. In the back seat, Thomas could see the silhouette of a small child. The argument continued as the family got into the car, the woman's voice becoming more insistent that she should drive, the man becoming more belligerent about his capabilities. Thomas had seen this scene play out countless times. During his years on the street, drunk drivers who thought they were invincible, families whose lives hung in the balance of one person's poor decision. The BMW pulled out of the parking lot too fast, its rear wheels sliding slightly on the ice. Thomas watched it disappear down 5th Street, heading toward the freeway entrance. He tried to go back to sleep, but something nagged at him. The sound of the child's voice he'd heard briefly through the open car door, scared and small. 20 minutes later, Thomas heard the sirens. He knew, even before he saw the flashing lights reflecting off the buildings, that the BMW hadn't made it to its destination. The crash scene was 6 blocks away. But in the still night air, he could hear the shouting of first responders, the hiss of hydraulic rescue equipment, the controlled chaos that accompanied serious accidents. Thomas tried to tell himself it wasn't his problem. He was a homeless drunk, not a soldier. These weren't his people to protect, his mission to complete. But old habits die hard, and the part of him that had once been responsible for the lives of others wouldn't let him ignore what he knew was happening. He pulled himself out of his sleeping bag, stuffed his belongings into his duffel, and started walking toward the lights. The scene was worse than he'd expected. The BMW had hit black ice on the entrance, ramp to I-84, and rolled down an embankment. The car was upside down in a drainage ditch, partially submerged in icy water that was flowing faster than usual due to the recent rains. Emergency vehicles lined the road above, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. Thomas could see rescue workers setting up lights and equipment, but they were moving slowly, carefully, taking time to assess the situation and ensure their own safety before attempting a rescue, time they might not have. Thomas had seen enough vehicle accidents in Afghanistan to know that the first few minutes were critical. Cold water, injuries, possible fuel leaks, every second of delay decreased the chances of survival. He also knew that the approaching emergency crews, for all their training and equipment, were thinking about procedure and safety protocols. Thomas was thinking about a child's voice in the back seat of a car that was now underwater. He didn't announce himself to the emergency responders. He didn't ask permission or wait for orders. He simply dropped his duffel bag by the side of the road and made his way down the embankment, moving with the quick, sure steps of someone who had navigated far more dangerous terrain in far worse conditions. The first firefighter to spot him shouted, "Hey, you can't be down here! This is a restricted area." Thomas ignored him. He was already at the edge of the drainage ditch, assessing the situation with the tactical mind that 3 decades of military service had burned into his brain. The car was upside down, the roof partially submerged. The driver's side was deeper in the water than the passenger side. No movement visible through the windows, which could mean unconsciousness or worse. The water was numbingly cold, cold enough to kill within minutes, especially for a child. Thomas waded into the ditch without hesitation. Sir, you need to get out of there immediately. The fire captain was now at the edge of the embankment, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed in emergency situations. Thomas reached the car and tried the doors, locked, and likely jammed from the impact anyway. He could see inside now. The man from the parking lot was hanging upside down in the driver's seat, blood trickling from his forehead but conscious and moving. The woman was slumped unconscious in the passenger seat, and in the back, partially submerged in the rising water, was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She was conscious but terrified, her eyes wide above the waterline, trying to keep her head up as the cold water rose around her. She had maybe 2 minutes before the water level reached her face. Thomas tried the rear door, also jammed. The windows were the only option, but he had nothing to break them with except his hands and boots. The reinforced glass of a luxury vehicle wasn't going to give way easily. From above, he could hear the fire captain on his radio. We have a civilian in the water. I need officers down here to remove him immediately so we can begin rescue operations. The little girl's chin was now touching the water. 1 minute, maybe less. Thomas made a decision that would have been familiar to anyone who had served under his command in Afghanistan. When lives hang in the balance, you don't wait for perfect conditions or ideal equipment. You use what you have and you act. He pulled off his heavy work boot and slammed it against the rear passenger window with the focused violence of a man who had once breached buildings under enemy fire. The first blow spiderwebbed the glass. The second shattered it completely. The little girl started crying as Thomas reached through the window to unlock the door. His hands bleeding from the glass, but his movements calm and controlled. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the same steady tone he'd once used to calm frightened soldiers. "I'm going to get you out of here." The water was up to her nose now. Thomas reached into the car and lifted her out, cradling her against his chest as he turned back toward the embankment. She was shivering violently, her lips blue from the cold, but she was breathing and conscious. "I've got you," Thomas murmured as he carried her through the water. "You're safe now." By the time he reached the edge of the ditch, firefighters were in the water behind him, moving toward the car to extract the parents. Paramedics were waiting with warming blankets and emergency equipment. The entire rescue operation was now in full swing, but it was Thomas who handed the little girl to the waiting EMTs. "Hypothermia," he said tersely, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone giving a medical brief. "Approximately 4 minutes of cold water exposure. Core temperature likely dropping rapidly. She'll need aggressive rewarming and cardiac monitoring." The paramedic looked at Thomas with surprise. The medical terminology and clinical assessment weren't what he'd expected from a homeless man who'd just performed a reckless river rescue. "Are you injured?" the paramedic asked, noticing the blood on Thomas's hands. "Superficial lacerations," Thomas replied automatically. "Nothing serious." The fire captain appeared beside them, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion. "Sir, what you just did was incredibly dangerous and completely against protocol. You could have been killed and you interfered with our rescue operation." Thomas looked at him with the flat, unemotional gaze that had once made Taliban fighters think twice about engaging his unit. "Your operation would have taken another 5 minutes to implement. She had less than 1 minute before submersion. The math is simple." Before the captain could respond, Thomas picked up his duffel bag and started walking away from the scene. He'd done what needed to be done. The child was safe. The rest wasn't his concern, but Detective Santos, who had arrived with the police response to the accident, had been watching the entire interaction. Something about the homeless man's behavior, his tactical assessment of the situation, his medical knowledge, his absolute confidence under pressure, didn't match the profile of a broken-down street person. "Tom!" she called after him. "Tom, wait." Thomas stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm going to need a statement," Detective Santos said. "For the report." "The child is safe," Thomas replied. "The parents will be extracted. That's all that matters." "Tom," Detective Santos said more gently, "what you just did, that was extraordinary. Where did you learn to move like that? To think under pressure like that?" For a moment, Thomas's carefully maintained walls almost cracked. Detective Santos had been kind to him over the years, more patient than most of the officers who'd been called to move him along. She deserved an answer. But the answer was complicated, and Thomas had spent 3 years learning that most people weren't interested in complicated answers from homeless veterans. Military, he said simply, then resumed walking. Detective Santos watched him disappear into the darkness, making a mental note to follow up when things were less chaotic. Something about Thomas Mitchell didn't add up, and her instincts told her there was more to his story than anyone had bothered to discover. The little girl's name was Emma Chen, and she survived because Thomas had been willing to act when trained professionals were still setting up equipment. The parents, Robert and Jennifer Chen, suffered serious but non-life-threatening injuries and were hospitalized for observation. The story should have ended there, a tragic accident with a fortunate outcome, filed away in police reports and insurance claims. But Detective Santos couldn't let it go. She'd been a cop for 15 years and had seen plenty of heroes, other officers, firefighters, ordinary citizens who rose to extraordinary occasions. But Thomas's behavior at the accident scene had been different. It wasn't courage or adrenaline or lucky instinct. It was expertise. The way he'd assessed the situation, prioritized the most critical victim, calculated risk versus time, executed the rescue with minimal wasted motion, and provided accurate medical assessment afterward. It spoke of training that went far beyond basic military service. 3 days after the accident, Detective Santos drove to the stretch of 5th Street, where Thomas usually spent his days. She found him in his usual spot against the electronics store, a paper cup with a few coins beside him, staring at nothing with the 1,000-yard stare she'd seen in too many veterans. "Tom," she said, settling down on the sidewalk beside him. "How are you feeling?" He glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the middle distance. "Fine. Your hand's healing okay?" Thomas looked down at the bandages covering the cuts from the car window. He'd treated the wounds himself rather than going to the hospital. Another sign that he had more medical knowledge than he let on. "They're fine." Detective Santos was quiet for a moment, watching the morning foot traffic flow around them. People were giving them an even wider berth than usual. A homeless man was one thing, but a homeless man talking to a police officer suggested trouble they didn't want to witness. "Tom," she said finally, "I've been thinking about what happened the other night. What you did for that little girl." Thomas didn't respond, but she sensed his attention sharpen slightly. "The fire captain ran the numbers afterward," she continued. "Based on water temperature and the rate the car was sinking, Emma Chen had maybe 90 seconds left when you reached her. Your assessment was correct. Our rescue teams wouldn't have been in position in time." Still nothing from Thomas, but Detective Santos pressed on. "The thing is, most people, even most veterans, don't think that clearly under pressure. They don't calculate time versus risk with that kind of precision. They don't provide medical assessments using proper terminology. They don't move through dangerous terrain, like they've done it 1,000 times before." Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I pulled your military records," Detective Santos said quietly. Thomas turned to look at her directly for the first time, his eyes sharp and alert despite the alcohol on his breath. "That's interesting," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What did you find?" "That's the problem," Detective Santos replied. "I didn't find much of anything. Thomas Mitchell enlisted 1994, honorably discharged 2021, but most of your service record is classified, redacted, black bars, where the details should be." Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a warning that Detective Santos recognized from her time dealing with dangerous people. "Maybe," he said quietly. "There's a reason for that." "Maybe there is," she agreed. "But Tom, I've been doing this job for 15 years. I know the difference between someone who was a supply clerk and someone who did the kind of work that gets classified. What you did the other night, that wasn't basic training. That was something else entirely." Thomas picked up his paper cup and shook it, listening to the few coins rattle around inside. "What's your point, Detective?" "My point is that there's a little girl alive today because of what you did. And I think maybe it's time people knew who really saved her." "People know," Thomas said flatly. "Local crazy homeless guy jumps in river, gets lucky, doesn't die. End of story." "Is that really how you want it to end?" Thomas looked at her with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and pain. "Detective, do you know what happens when people find out who I used to be? They want explanations. They want to understand how someone goes from there to here." He gestured at his ragged clothing, his cardboard sign. "And I don't have answers they want to hear." Detective Santos studied his face, seeing past the beard and the weathered skin to something that reminded her of her own father, who'd come back from Vietnam with wounds that couldn't be seen. What if they didn't need explanations? She asked. What if they just needed to know that a hero was watching out for them? Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Detective, I haven't been a hero for a long time. I'm just a guy who can't sleep in a bed anymore, who can't be around crowds, who drinks too much because it's the only way to make the noise in my head stop. The man who saved that little girl? He's been dead for 3 years. That man pulled a child out of a freezing river while trained rescuers were still getting organized," Detective Santos said firmly. "That man calculated risk and time and physics in his head, while standing in water that could have killed him. That man is sitting right here talking to me. He's not dead, Tom. He's just buried under a lot of pain." Thomas was quiet for so long that Detective Santos thought the conversation was over. Then, in a voice so low she had to strain to hear it, he said, 27 years, 3 wars, 237 soldiers under my command at various times. You know how many I lost? Detective Santos waited. 0, Thomas said. Not one, not ever. That was my job, bring everyone home. And I was good at it. Very good at it. What happened? She asked gently. Thomas's hands were shaking slightly, whether from cold, alcohol withdrawal, or emotion. Detective Santos couldn't tell. Afghanistan. Last deployment. We were running convoy security in the mountains, and intelligence said the route was clear. It wasn't. His voice became mechanical, reciting facts. IED hit the lead vehicle. Insurgent fire from elevated positions. Classic ambush setup. He paused, staring at something only he could see. I had 2 wounded soldiers pinned down in a kill zone. Standard protocol said to call for air support and wait for backup. But the insurgents had RPGs and they were zeroing in. My men had maybe 5 minutes before they'd be overrun. Detective Santos found herself holding her breath. So I took a squad and flanked the insurgent position. 40-minute firefight on a mountain ridge. When it was over, we'd eliminated the threat and extracted both wounded soldiers. No additional casualties. That sounds like exactly what a good commander should do, Detective Santos said. Thomas's laugh was bitter. That's what the Silver Star citation said. What it didn't say was that one of the wounded soldiers I saved was 19 years old. Kid named Marcus Johnson from Detroit. He'd been in country for exactly 37 days. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. He died 3 days later. Not from his combat wounds, those healed fine. Blood clot from lying on his back in the hospital. Routine complication. 1 in 1,000 chance? Detective Santos began to understand. 27 years, Thomas continued. Perfect record. Never lost a soldier under my command. And the last thing I did as a colonel was save a kid, who died anyway because of a fucking blood clot. The profanity seemed to surprise Thomas himself, as if he'd forgotten he was talking to a police officer. That's when I understood, he said more quietly. It was all just an illusion. The control, the expertise, the ability to bring everyone home, it was just luck. And eventually everyone's luck runs out. Detective Santos was quiet for a moment, processing what Thomas had shared with her. Tom, she said finally, do you know how Emma Chen's parents are doing? Thomas shrugged. Assume they're fine. Hospitals are good at treating car accident injuries. They are fine, Detective Santos confirmed. And they've been asking about you. They want to thank you. Don't need thanks. Maybe not. But they need to give them. Emma especially. She's been having nightmares about the cold water. But her parents told her that a brave man saved her. She draws pictures of her hero now. Helps her process the trauma. Thomas's expression softened slightly. She draws you as a soldier, Detective Santos continued. Because somehow, even at 6 years old, she could tell that's what you were. What you are? I'm not a soldier anymore, Thomas said firmly. Tom, Detective Santos said, what do you think a soldier's job really is? To protect people. To serve something bigger than yourself. To stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. And what did you do 3 nights ago? Thomas was quiet, seeing the trap but unable to avoid it. That little girl is alive because you did exactly what you've always done, Detective Santos said. You stood between someone innocent and something that would have harmed her. You used your training, your experience, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for others. How is that not being a soldier? Because soldiers have support, Thomas replied. They have units, missions, purpose. They have people who understand what they do and why they do it. I'm just a guy living in doorways. Detective Santos made a decision that would change both their lives. What if that wasn't true anymore? She asked. Detective Santos's plan was simple in concept but complex in execution. She wanted to give Thomas back his identity, not by forcing him into a life he could no longer handle, but by showing the community who he really was and letting them decide how to respond. Her first stop was the Portland VA Medical Center, where she met with Dr. Rachel Martinez, the chief of psychiatry for the PTSD treatment program. I need your help with something, Detective Santos explained. I have a veteran who's been living on the streets for 3 years. Severe PTSD, drinking problem, complete social isolation. But 3 days ago he saved a child's life, and I think there might be an opportunity to change his trajectory. Dr. Martinez listened as Detective Santos described Thomas's background and current situation. When she finished, the psychiatrist was quiet for a moment. Detective, Dr. Martinez said finally, what you're describing isn't uncommon. High-functioning veterans who completely decompensate after retirement, especially those who held significant responsibility. The transition from being essential to being ordinary can be devastating. But he's not ordinary, Detective Santos insisted. What he did at that accident scene was extraordinary. I agree, and that's exactly the problem. Dr. Martinez leaned forward. Veterans like your Thomas don't just struggle with normal civilian life, they struggle with being normal at all. They're used to operating at a level of intensity and importance that the civilian world can't match. When they can't find that purpose, they sometimes choose to live in circumstances that match how worthless they feel. So how do we help him? Very carefully, Dr. Martinez replied, and with his consent. Forced intervention rarely works with combat veterans. They've been trained to resist interrogation and pressure, but if he's willing to accept help. Detective Santos's second stop was Portland General Hospital, where she met with Dr. James Chen, Emma's father, who was recovering from his injuries in a private room. Mr. Chen, she said, I'm Detective Santos with Portland Police. I investigated your accident. Detective, Dr. Chen said, struggling to sit up straighter. Have you found the man who saved Emma? We've been trying to locate him to thank him. That's actually why I'm here, Detective Santos replied. But first, I need to tell you something about him that might surprise you. She explained Thomas's situation, the homelessness, the alcoholism, the way society had written him off as just another street person. Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly serious as she spoke. You're telling me that my daughter was saved by a homeless veteran, and no one knows who he really is? That's correct, and I'm hoping you might help change that. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, processing the information. Detective, I'm an emergency room physician. Do you know how many times I've seen homeless veterans come through my department? Overdoses, exposure, violence. We treat them and release them back to the streets because there's nowhere else for them to go. This particular veteran has skills that saved your daughter's life, Detective Santos pointed out. I understand that. What I'm saying is that maybe it's time we stopped seeing the homeless as problems to be solved and started seeing them as people with stories. We haven't bothered to learn. Dr. Chen reached for his phone. Detective, I'm going to make some calls. If this man is willing to accept help, I think we can do better than just saying thank you. Detective Santos's third and most important stop was back to 5th Street, where she found Thomas in his usual spot. This time she came with backup, not police backup, but Dr. Martinez from the VA. Tom, Detective Santos said, I'd like you to meet Dr. Martinez. She works with veterans. Thomas looked at the psychiatrist with deep suspicion. I'm not interested in therapy, Detective. I'm not here to offer therapy, Dr. Martinez said calmly. I'm here because Detective Santos told me about what you did for the Chen family, and I wanted to meet the man who made that rescue. Wasn't a rescue, Thomas said. Was just the right thing to do. That's exactly what makes it a rescue, Dr. Martinez replied. Tom, can I ask you something? When you were in command, how did you make decisions under pressure? Thomas looked at her warily but answered. You assess the situation, identify the mission-critical priorities, calculate available resources against required outcomes, and execute with acceptable risk. And is that what you did at the accident scene? I suppose. Tom, Dr. Martinez said gently, you didn't stop being a soldier. When you left the army, you just stopped having missions that matched your capabilities. Thomas was quiet for a moment. What's your point, Doctor? My point is that maybe it's time you had a mission again. Dr. Martinez explained the program she had in mind, not traditional therapy, but a peer support role where Thomas would work with other homeless veterans, using his experience and natural leadership abilities to help them navigate the system. The VA has funding for veteran peer specialists, she explained. It's not charity, it's a paying job with benefits. You'd be helping other veterans who are where you are now. I'm not qualified to help anyone, Thomas said. You saved a child's life 3 days ago, Detective Santos pointed out. You've kept yourself alive on the streets for 3 years. You served with distinction for 27 years. How exactly are you not qualified? Thomas looked between the two women, seeing something in their faces that he hadn't seen in years. Respect. Not pity, not charity, but genuine respect for who he was and what he could do. I'd need to think about it, he said finally. Of course, Dr. Martinez replied. But Tom, while you're thinking, I want you to consider something. Every day you spend on this street, there are other veterans who think their only choice is to follow the same path. You could show them different. That evening, Thomas sat in his usual doorway, but instead of drinking himself to sleep, he found himself thinking about Dr. Martinez's words. For 3 years, he'd focused on his failures, the career that ended, the family that left, the normal life he couldn't sustain. But today, 2 people had looked at him and seen not a failure, but someone with value. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. James Chen appeared on 5th Street, walking slowly due to his injuries but determined to find Thomas. Are you the man who saved my daughter? Dr. Chen asked when he spotted Thomas. Thomas nodded reluctantly. My name is James Chen. Emma is my daughter. How is she? Thomas asked. The first time in years that he'd initiated a conversation with a stranger. She's fine thanks to you. But she's been asking about you. She wants to know if you're okay. Thomas was surprised by the question. She's worried about me? Children see things differently than adults, Dr. Chen explained. She knows you helped her when she was scared. Now she's worried that you might be scared and need help too. Dr. Chen sat down on the sidewalk beside Thomas, ignoring the stares of passing pedestrians. I'm a doctor, he said. I've seen a lot of heroes in my work, paramedics, firefighters, nurses, other doctors. But what you did was different. You had no training in water rescue, no protective equipment, no backup. You just saw someone in trouble and acted. Anyone would have done the same, Thomas said. No, Dr. Chen replied firmly. They wouldn't have. Most people would have waited for professionals, or called 911, or assumed someone else would handle it. You calculated the risk, made a decision, and executed it flawlessly. That's not normal civilian behavior. That's military leadership. Dr. Chen pulled out his phone and showed Thomas a video. It was security camera footage from a building near the accident scene, showing Thomas's rescue of Emma in grainy black and white. The fire department asked for this footage for their report, Dr. Chen explained. But when I watched it, I realized something. You didn't hesitate. You didn't panic. You moved with purpose and precision. You've done this before, haven't you? Not car rescue specifically, but high-pressure situations where lives depended on your decisions. Thomas watched himself on the small screen, a figure moving through the water with determined efficiency, extracting the child, carrying her to safety. For a moment, he could see what Dr. Chen saw. Not a homeless drunk, but a soldier completing a mission. Emma draws pictures of you, Dr. Chen continued. She calls you her soldier angel. She doesn't understand why adults keep calling you homeless. To her, you're the brave man who saved her when she was scared. Thomas felt something crack in his chest, not breaking but opening. Dr. Chen, he said quietly, I'm not the man I used to be. I can't handle normal life anymore. I can't sleep indoors, can't be around crowds, can't maintain relationships. The person your daughter thinks I am, he doesn't exist anymore. Maybe he doesn't, Dr. Chen agreed. But the person who saved Emma exists. The person who's sitting here worried about whether a 6-year-old girl is okay exists. Maybe that's enough. Dr. Chen reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. This is from Emma, he said. She wanted me to give it to you. Thomas opened the envelope with hands that shook slightly. Inside was a child's drawing in bright crayon colors. It showed a man in what might have been a military uniform, carrying a small girl away from a blue scribble that was presumably water. At the top, in a child's careful printing, were the words, "Thank you for saving me." At the bottom, in what was obviously an adult's handwriting, was a note. Emma says to tell you that heroes take care of each other. She wants to know if you need taking care of too. Thomas stared at the drawing for a long time, seeing it through the eyes of a child who didn't know about his failures, his broken civilian life, his years of drinking and despair. To Emma, he was simply the person who had helped her when she needed help. That afternoon, Thomas walked to the VA Medical Center and asked to speak with Dr. Martinez. "I've been thinking about what you said," he told her, "about having a mission again. And I think I'd like to try." Dr. Martinez smiled. "Good, when can you start?" The transition wasn't immediate or easy. Thomas spent his first week in VA-provided temporary housing having panic attacks every time he tried to sleep in a bed. The walls felt too close, the silence too complete. But Dr. Martinez had warned him this would happen. And more importantly, she'd given him strategies to cope. Instead of fighting the discomfort, Thomas learned to work with it. He kept his window open, slept on the floor when the bed felt wrong, and gradually began to reclaim pieces of himself that he'd thought were lost forever. His first day as a peer support specialist was terrifying. Thomas stood outside the VA's Homeless Outreach Center, wearing donated clothes that actually fit, and carrying a clipboard with the names of veterans he was supposed to help. Feeling like an imposter, what did he know about helping people? He couldn't even help himself. But when he met Jerry, a Vietnam veteran who'd been living under a bridge for 2 years, something clicked. Jerry had the same 1,000-yard stare, the same defensive posture, the same carefully maintained distance from anything that might hurt him. Thomas recognized it because he'd seen it in his own mirror for 3 years. "They send you to fix me?" Jerry asked when Thomas introduced himself. "Nobody can fix anyone else," Thomas replied honestly. "But maybe we can figure out how to not be so broken." That conversation led to others. Within a month, Thomas was working with 12 homeless veterans, not as their counselor or caseworker, but as someone who understood exactly where they were and how they'd gotten there. He didn't offer false hope or easy solutions. Instead, he offered something more valuable, proof that it was possible to find purpose again, even when everything else seemed lost. The work gave Thomas what he'd been missing for 3 years, a mission that mattered. Every veteran he helped get into housing, every success story, every small victory reminded him that his skills still had value. He wasn't commanding soldiers anymore, but he was still protecting people, just in a different way. 3 months after Emma Chen's rescue, Detective Santos received a call that would complete the circle of redemption that had started with Thomas's moment of heroism. "Detective Santos? This is Sarah Mitchell. I think you know my ex-husband." Detective Santos was quiet for a moment, recognizing the name from Thomas's military records. "Mrs. Mitchell, how did you get my number?" "I saw the news story about what Tom did for that little girl. The video has been all over social media. I called the Portland Police Department and asked them to connect me with the investigating officer." Sarah's voice was shaky, emotional. "Detective, I need to ask you something. Is Tom okay? Really okay?" Detective Santos chose her words carefully. "He's getting help, Mrs. Mitchell. He's working again. He has housing. She paused, trying to find the right description. "He's finding his way back." "I left him," Sarah said quietly. 3 years ago, I took our children and left him because I couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. I thought I was protecting the kids from seeing their father fall apart." "That must have been incredibly difficult," Detective Santos said. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done. But Detective, when I saw that video, when I saw Tom saving that little girl, that's the man I married. That's the father my children remember. He's still in there, isn't he?" "Yes," Detective Santos said simply. "He's still in there. My kids have been asking about him. They're old enough now to understand that Daddy was sick, not bad. They want to see him." Detective Santos felt the weight of the moment. "Mrs. Mitchell, I think that conversation needs to happen between you and Tom. I can give you the contact information for his caseworker at the VA, but this has to be his choice. I understand, I needed to know he was okay, that there was hope." "There's hope," Detective Santos confirmed. The reunion happened 6 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon at a quiet park in southeast Portland. Thomas sat on a bench, wearing clothes that fit and a face that showed he'd been sober for months, waiting for the family he hadn't seen in 3 years. When Sarah arrived with their 2 children, Michael, now 16, and Jessica, 13, Thomas almost lost his nerve. They looked so much older, so much more grown up than his memories of them. Would they even recognize him? Would they want to? Jessica saw him first and broke away from her mother, running across the park with the abandon of a child who'd missed her father desperately. When she threw her arms around him, Thomas felt pieces of his heart that had been frozen for years begin to thaw. "Daddy," she whispered against his shoulder. "We saw you on the news. You saved that little girl." Michael approached more cautiously, with the careful assessment of a teenager who'd learned not to trust too easily. But when Thomas stood and extended his hand, Michael ignored it and hugged him instead. "We missed you, Dad," he said simply. Sarah hung back, giving her children time with their father, but Thomas could see the tears on her face. When the kids finally stepped back, Thomas and Sarah looked at each other across 3 years of pain and separation. "You look good, Tom," she said softly. "I'm trying," he replied. "Every day I'm trying. The kids want to spend time with you, if you're ready for that." Thomas looked at his children, his son who was nearly a man now, his daughter who'd grown from a little girl into a young woman, and felt the weight of all the time he'd lost to his own demons. "I'd like that," he said. "But Sarah, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same man you married. The war changed me and I can't change back. I'm learning to live with who I am now, but I'll never be who I was before." Sarah nodded. "I know. And I need you to understand something too. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I didn't know how to help you. And I was afraid of losing the kids too." "You did the right thing," Thomas said, and meant it. They needed stability. They needed a parent who could take care of them. "Maybe," Sarah said. "But they also needed their father, and now, maybe we can figure out how to make that work." The conversation was interrupted by Emma Chen, who appeared with her parents at the edge of the park. Dr. Chen had called Thomas earlier in the week to ask if Emma could see him again. She'd been asking about her soldier angel and wanted to make sure he was okay. Emma ran toward Thomas with the same enthusiasm Jessica had shown, but stopped short when she saw the other children. "Are these your kids?" she asked Thomas seriously. "Yes," Thomas replied. "This is Michael and Jessica." Emma studied them for a moment, then made a pronouncement with the authority that only 6-year-olds possess. "You're really lucky. Your daddy is a hero." Michael and Jessica looked at their father with new eyes, seeing him not just as the broken man who had left them, but as the person Emma saw, someone who helped others when they needed help. That evening, after the Chens had left and his own family had returned to their hotel, Thomas sat in his small apartment and thought about the day. 3 years ago, he'd been convinced that his story was over, that he had nothing left to offer the world. But Emma Chen had been wrong about one thing. He wasn't lucky to have children who thought he was a hero. They were lucky to have a father who had remembered, in his darkest moment, that some things were worth fighting for. Detective Santos visited Thomas a week later, finding him at the VA center where he now worked, full-time as a peer support specialist. "How are you doing, Tom?" she asked. "Good," he said, and for the first time in years, he meant it. "Really good. Any regrets about coming forward? About letting people know who you really are?" Thomas considered the question. His story had indeed gone viral. The homeless veteran who saved a child, the decorated colonel who'd lost everything and found himself again. There had been interviews, requests for speaking engagements, offers of book deals. Thomas had declined most of them, preferring to focus on his work with other veterans. "No regrets," he said finally. "But Detective, I need to tell you something. What happened that night, it wasn't about me becoming a hero again. It was about remembering that I never stopped being one." "What do you mean?" "For 3 years I thought I was broken beyond repair. I thought the man I used to be was dead. But when I saw that little girl in the water, I didn't think about my failures or my problems or my fears. I just did what needed to be done. That's who I've always been, even when I couldn't see it." Thomas gestured toward the window, where they could see some of his veteran clients gathering for their afternoon group session. "These men and women out there, they think they're broken too. They think their service doesn't matter anymore, that they don't have anything to offer. But they're wrong. They just need someone to remind them who they really are. Detective Santos smiled. And you're that someone. I'm trying to be. Every day I'm trying to be. As Detective Santos left the VA center, she reflected on the journey that had brought Thomas from the streets to this moment. It hadn't been charity or pity that saved him. It had been recognition. Recognition of his value, his skills, his fundamental identity as someone who served others. The homeless veteran had never really existed. There had only been a decorated soldier who had temporarily lost sight of his mission. And sometimes, all it takes to save someone is helping them remember who they really are. 6 months later, Thomas stood at a podium in the Portland Convention Center, addressing a national conference on veteran homelessness. In the audience sat Emma Chen and her parents, Detective Santos, Dr. Martinez, and Thomas's own family, Sarah, Michael, and Jessica, who had moved back to Portland to be closer to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice carrying the same authority it had once held when addressing soldiers. "When we see a homeless veteran on the street, we often see failure. Someone who couldn't adapt, couldn't overcome, couldn't transition to civilian life." He paused, looking out at the hundreds of faces watching him. "But what if we're looking at it wrong? What if instead of seeing failure, we saw potential? What if instead of seeing someone who needs to be fixed, we saw someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength?" Thomas told his story then, not as a tale of redemption, but as a reminder that heroes don't stop being heroes just because they're struggling. They just need someone to see past the struggle to the person underneath. "The night I pulled Emma Chen from that car," he concluded, "I wasn't a homeless man who became a hero. I was a hero who happened to be homeless. The difference matters, because it reminds us that our circumstances don't define our character. Our choices do." The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but Thomas was focused on one person in the audience, Emma Chen, now 7 years old, applauding with the serious concentration of someone who understood that her soldier angel was helping other people remember that they were angels too. After the speech, Emma approached Thomas with another drawing, this one showing multiple figures in military uniforms, all helping other people. "This is you helping other soldiers," she explained seriously, "because that's what heroes do." Thomas knelt down to her level, just as he had that first day at the VA when he'd met Jerry under the bridge. "Emma," he said gently, "can I tell you a secret?" She nodded solemnly. "You helped me too. When I saw you in that car, you reminded me who I was supposed to be. So really, we helped each other." Emma considered this seriously, then smiled with the wisdom that sometimes comes from the mouths of babes. "That's what friends do," she said simply. And Thomas realized that she was right. Heroes take care of each other. Sometimes you save someone from drowning. Sometimes you save someone from despair. Sometimes you save someone from forgetting who they really are. But it's all the same mission. In the end, standing between the innocent and the things that would harm them, whether those things are physical danger or emotional darkness or the terrible weight of believing you no longer matter. Thomas Mitchell had been many things in his life: soldier, colonel, leader, broken man, homeless veteran. But in the end, he was what he had always been: someone who served others, someone who protected the vulnerable, someone who stood watch so that others could sleep safely. The mission had never changed. He had just needed to remember what it was. 2 years later, Thomas received a letter that would complete his journey in a way he never expected. It came from the Department of Defense, with official seals and formal language that he recognized from his military days. Inside was a notification that he had been selected to receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, for his actions during that firefight in Afghanistan, where he'd saved Marcus Johnson. The award had been delayed due to classified mission details, but his commanding officers had finally succeeded in getting his heroism officially recognized. The ceremony was held at the Portland VA Medical Center, with Thomas's family, his veteran clients, Detective Santos, Dr. Martinez, and the Chen family in attendance. But for Thomas, the most meaningful moment came when a young man in dress blues approached him after the presentation. "Sir," the soldier said, saluting sharply. "Sergeant First Class Marcus Johnson, Jr., United States Army. I believe you knew my father." Thomas stared at the young man, seeing Marcus Johnson's features in the face of his son. "Your father was a good soldier," Thomas said quietly. He died too young. Yes, sir. But before he died, he told me about the colonel who saved his life in Afghanistan. He said that when I was old enough, I should find you and thank you for giving him 3 extra days to tell me he loved me. The young sergeant's voice broke slightly. Sir, those 3 days meant everything to our family. My father died knowing he'd been saved by a hero, and he made sure I knew it too. Thomas felt tears running down his face, the first tears he'd allowed himself to shed for Marcus Johnson's death. Sergeant, he said, your father was the hero. He was brave enough to put himself in harm's way for his brothers. I just did my job. Sir, with respect, Sergeant Johnson replied. Saving people is your job. Then now, always. My father told me that some men are born to stand between evil and innocent people. He said you were one of those men. Marcus Johnson, Jr. reached into his dress uniform and pulled out a small American flag. This flew over Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan, sir. Where my father served, where you saved him. I thought you should have it. Thomas accepted the flag with hands that no longer shook from alcohol or despair, but from the weight of honor being returned to him. That evening, Thomas sat in his apartment, a real apartment now, with furniture and pictures and signs of a life being rebuilt, and called Sarah. The kids want to come for Thanksgiving, she said. All of us together. Are you ready for that? Thomas looked around his home, thinking about the long journey from that freezing night in December when he'd pulled Emma Chen from the water. He thought about the homeless veterans he worked with every day, seeing hope replace despair in their eyes. He thought about his children, who had forgiven him for the years he'd been lost. He thought about Emma, who still sent him drawings and considered him her personal hero. Yes, he said. I'm ready. The next morning, Thomas walked to his old spot on 5th Street, not to sit with a cardboard sign, but to meet Jerry, who was struggling with the transition from street to housing. As he approached, he saw a new figure huddled in the doorway where he'd once spent so many cold nights. Thomas knelt down beside the young veteran, recognizing the 1,000-yard stare, the defensive posture, the careful distance from hope. Hey there, Thomas said gently. I'm Tom. I work with the VA's homeless outreach program. But before that, I used to sit right where you're sitting. The young man looked up suspiciously. Yeah, and now you're here to save me? Thomas smiled, remembering asking Detective Santos almost the same question. No, he said. Nobody can save anybody else. But maybe we can figure out how to not be so broken. And maybe, if you're willing, I can show you that the person you were before you ended up here, that person isn't gone. He's just forgotten what his mission is. The young veteran studied Thomas's face, seeing something there that spoke of shared experience, shared pain and shared hope. What's your name, son? Thomas asked. Rodriguez, the young man replied. Army, 2 tours in Iraq. Well, Rodriguez, Thomas said, settling down beside him. Let me tell you about a little girl named Emma Chen, and how she reminded me who I really was. As Thomas began to tell his story, he realized that this was how healing really worked. Not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but through one broken person helping another remember that they still had value, still had purpose, still had a mission worth completing. The circle was complete now. The homeless veteran had become the helper. The saved had become the saver. The lost had become the guide. And somewhere in Portland, a 7-year-old girl named Emma Chen was drawing pictures of soldiers helping other soldiers, because that's what heroes do. Thomas Mitchell had finally come home from the war, not to the life he'd left behind, but to the life he was meant to live, standing watch over those who needed protection, serving those who needed hope, and proving every day that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought in the hearts of those who refuse to give up on each other. His mission continued. It had never really ended. The distance between broken and whole is often just one person who refuses to give up on you. And sometimes the person who saves you is the one you thought was beyond saving themselves. Heroes don't retire from being heroes. They just find new battles to fight, new people to protect, new ways to serve something greater than themselves. This story is dedicated to all the homeless veterans who carry invisible wounds, and to those who refuse to let them carry them alone.